So, all right, now we are live online for our final discussion of Stacy Alaimo's Bodily Natures, but not our final discussion around the topic, since we do know that Stacy will be joining us in roughly 2 weeks. We're still trying to iron out a date and time that will work both for her and for us. And I was thinking that the group of us might read the new Latour article that Brandon pointed out to me in NLH, right?
What did I do now?
Surely, surely this was you. Bruno Latour has agency in the era of the Anthropocene.
No, I think that must have been like Magda or something on the SCT
Okay, yeah.
group.
Sorry, I
did see that though.
But yeah, so Bruno Latour has a new article out in I think it's New Literary History.
Yeah, I did see that.
A great one for us to kind of read and discuss with Stacy Alaimo in 2 weeks. So
yes, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so I'm going to posit that to her. I'm sure that she will be amenable to it because I don't want to spend the whole time just hashing over her book, but like having a productive conversation that moves us all.
I think it would be really cool to connect to like, especially like that, the Latour article, and then the Anthropocene Feminism Conference that was just in Milwaukee. I think that would be really cool
for everyone to start talking about the importance of the Anthropocene and agency in the work that we're all doing. So Stacy Alaimo will join us for a conversation in that vein, if not exactly that vein, in a couple of weeks. So that's really great. And today we're going to be discussing the final chapter of this book on genetics, agency, and ethics. And possibly, depending on what people got to, we may or may not be discussing the Companion Species Manifesto, which I might ask Carl to say a few words about, or Sandra Harding's Whose Science and Whose Knowledge. Brandon, did you have a chance to read that?
I had read some Sandra Harding earlier this semester and last semester as well, so I'm familiar with her work, and then I've read bits and pieces of Haraway's When Species Meet, and just took a look at the like precursor to the Companion Species Manifesto that's in the Haraway reader that Alaimo cites in this chapter. So I took a look at that. There's some Whitehead in there too, which is awesome.
I know.
There's beautiful.
I outlined that as I was reading through it, and I was like, "Oh, Brandon's going to be so happy."
I was very happy.
Some process philosophy for everyone and emergent agency, and then Carl, I can only assume that you are a person who knows a great deal about the Companion Species Manifesto, but I may be assuming too much.
Perhaps you are. I did read it maybe 10 years ago. It feels like now 8 years ago.
It would be 10 years ago when it came out. So.
Yeah, I think it came out in 2002. But I've taught When Species Meet chunks of it many times. I've run a reading group on it, and I actually just taught the Cyborg Manifesto for Cyborgs in my lit theory class on Monday night. And what I noted there, and this is maybe a possible lead into some of our discussion, is the way that students, and also I think the secondary literature, tends to undersell the fact that Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto is a very early entrance into critical animal theory. That it's, despite the title, it's also about animals, and it's about basically denaturalizing the distinctions between machine, man, and animal. And also, of course, what's undersold in a lot of the student responses to it, and also the secondary literature, I think, is the socialist feminist aspect of that essay. It's really prescient. When I tell my students it was written in the mid-'80s, they tend to be shocked and surprised that it's there, but I think it's also one of the things that marks is a kind of critical forgetting that happens, which is something I think that also probably surrounds Harding's work in relation to the new materialisms, which is, of course, which often tends to undersell the feminist science studies, and it's sort of reopening the question of agency. The Harding book is what? This is 20 years ago?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah, it's like 90 or something like that.
So that's sort of my initial response to your question about Haraway. I can speak about Haraway's work on animals a bit, and what distinguishes it from a lot of critical animal theory, if we need to later on.
Well, I think that maybe a place to start is, and this doesn't necessarily have to be you, Carl, but we might think about this idea of nature cultures, which kind of bridges us to last week. I think it was last week where we were doing the Bell queer nature cultures. Yes, it was just last week. So the queer nature cultures was using Haraway's idea of the nature culture and then extending that concept into the queer realm. And so I thought we might take a moment to talk about nature cultures and then to reach back to queer nature cultures and then jump into maybe the genetic aspect of the other readings, or the genomic taxogenomic properties, or as Haraway calls it, what is it? Symbiogenetics.
Have you heard her talk about what is it? Oh, it's like the sympoiesis or something instead of
Sympoiesis. No, but
I've heard her in, maybe that Allie might know this. Didn't she mention this in her talk? I feel like her recent talk. Didn't she mention sympoiesis? Am I saying that?
Yeah,
right?
I think that's right. The one that I posted online, that recent one.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
recent one that was just like a couple months ago or something.
Yeah.
Where and this is something, Carl, I think she's building on a section of When Species Meet, where she's trying to draw on Margulies and Sagan and symbiogenesis, but to make it less reliant on autopoiesis.
Right.
And to instead have kind of, difference in turtles all the way down, instead of this self-organizing that we have with autopoiesis. Sorry,
that's
you
fine.
just totally sent me on.
Turtles all the way down. Does that come from somewhere? What is that?
It's something. I'm not sure exactly where, actually.
Okay, fair enough. Because
looking it up.
One thing too, Angie, I think would be interesting to kind of throw into the nature culture conversation, or maybe to kind of kickstart it, is when we use the term nature cultures, is that a synonym for the material semiotic or the material discursive? Are these two kind of combinations of terms doing the same work? Why would we use one versus one combo?
I think that's a really good question. It seems to me that the earliest printed version of Turtles All the Way Down is 1854. Thank you, Carl. Cool. Which is great, because the place where I first encountered it is in code. Turtle is a form of triples, and the joke is that it's triples all the way down. And I'm just like, what is this? And then we had elephants all the way down.
Yes.
And I was like, what? So I'm just gonna.
Shoulders of giants all the way down.
Strange animals all the way down.
Well, and here's a great instance of semantic nature culture, right? The way in which the animal is somehow assigned, and not reducible to the animal itself or a specific semantic meaning, which is great. But I think that your question about nature cultures and the material discursive is a really appropriate one, Brandon, because it seems like they are distinct, but that they work together is maybe the best way to put that, right? Because the nature culture gets at the idea that there is no separation between nature and culture, and that they are both co-constitutive, right? And that nature and culture are constituting each other and intertwined at any given moment in any given space, right? And I really liked the use of the co-evolution of dogs and humans to demonstrate this, right? The way in which dogs and humans are not separate entities that pre-exist dog-human relationships, but that dogs and humans create each other through their interaction over time, right? And I think that the issue of scale that she gets at here, which she talks about as being both like a species scale, right, and like the trajectory of the species throughout long periods of generation, and the local scale, which depends upon the face-to-face interaction of species in order to participate in that generative history. That those things are linked but not the same. And so in the same way, like nature culture has these two scales where nature and culture are a part of the same fabric, which is why they are one word, or why she has, what is that, made this metaplasm. This metaplasmic.
Is that what she calls it?
Yes, well, right, metaplasm is basically her way of talking about the swerve of words. If we're to take something from Lucretius there, right, the deviation of one word or phrase or semantic unit to somehow mean or stand in for something else, and the remodeling of words, which is why I can't.
It's a little more positive than, say, neologism.
Yes, it is, because it's not about it being new. It's about it being remodeled, the remolding of the codes of life. And the reason that she uses this word metaplasm is because she thinks of it as something very material, right?
Is this in Companion Species?
This is in Companion Species. It's on page 20 of the PDF that I put online. So she's talking about metaplasm means a change in a word, right? For example, by adding, omitting, inverting, or transposing its letters, syllables, or sounds, right? The term is from the Greek metaplasmos, meaning remodeling or remolding. Metaplasm is a generic term for almost any kind of alteration in a word, intentional or unintentional, right? She is using metaplasm to mean the remodeling of dog and human flesh. So the words made flesh, in particular, that she sees etched in DNA. Like, so that's another phrase that she uses, and she talks specifically in the next paragraph about a substitution in a string of bases of nucleic acid can also be a metaplasm, right? Like, that's a remodeling of the ribonucleic acid semantic structure that can change the course of a gene and alter the course of a life. So she says it's a swerving that tells the truth, which there's no way that you could have possibly know this, but brings up the horrible taste of Stephen Greenblatt in my mouth. But I'm going to leave that alone entirely. So I just want to mark that, and if anybody wants to pick it up, you can or not. So the nature culture is this kind of metaplasm. But the thing that she points out about metaplasm further is that she likes its biological taste, right? And the plasm in particular, which is about the modeling or the molding or the stuff, right? And so the nature cultures refers to, what's that, Carl?
Oh, I'm just holding up the book.
Oh, yes. Right, so the nature cultures is this kind of plasma where the nature and the culture are materially intertwined, and it seems to me that the material discursive is the way in which any actor makes some kind of legible sense of nature culture.
Right, and I think one of the advantages of a term like that is it gets us away from the genes determine everything narrative, right, where it's all on the side of nature and it's all on the side of the smallest units of causation. Because once you bring culture into the picture and metaplasmically link it with nature, then you start getting things like aesthetics factoring in and determining what's a viable mutation, right? Where it's no longer purely kind of random outcomes. It's never purely a random outcome, but what constitutes a viable mutation also has to do with what humans want out of their dogs and what dogs want out of their humans and what dogs want out of other dogs, right? Where that kind of choice, which is always going to be in excess of any kind of mathematical calculation, is also something that's going to determine which genes get passed on. And so I guess what I'm saying is that the Haraway is a nice riposte to something we see quite frequently, which is that genes explain everything and genes function in the biological realm in the way that particles do in their own physics, and that the truest version of biological science is genetics, and the truest version of natural science is physics. And both of these, of course, write culture and aesthetics out of the picture.
Well, and what's great about that you point out, Carl, is that of course anybody who's paying attention to quantum physics knows that the particle is not nearly as definite as we would like to think, or as it is in the popular imagination. So too with the gene, right? And that's precisely where I think Alaimo is entering into her discussion in the 6th chapter. So that might be a good time to talk about or to turn to what Alaimo is getting at in this chapter on genetics, material agency, and the evolution of post-human environmental ethics in science fiction. Which is a rather long chapter title. But I guess all I would say is that I like the way that she's set up sort of the narrative of genetics as it was understood when it participated in a Cartesian Cartesian epistemology, which is that once the human genome was mapped, or once we knew everything in the human genome, we would somehow have mastered both the genome and humanity and all biological interactions that humanity could have thereafter. And of course, after knowing that the human genome after the human genome has been mapped, we're well aware of the fact that none of those things is really true. But we had to somehow master it first in order to understand the limits of that knowledge. And yet the guy who did it doesn't seem to have understood that at all, because he says he has conquered, right? That's the word he uses, conquered the human genome, which just sets up the problem so perfectly that she then explores through the rest of the chapter.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I really I would love to see if she's not to kind of plug my own personal literature preferences here, but like Richard Powers' stuff on genetics is a lot along these lines. Like, he has these molecular biologist and geneticist protagonists who, especially at the time, right after the double helix structure was discovered. This is in the Goldbug variations,
right?
And where the scientist protagonist is completely against the Human Genome Project and the cataloging of genes and this kind of colonization, and it's all about kind of attending to what the genes are doing themselves and letting them kind of proliferate instead of cataloging them. And his approach to kind of discovering the code is so different from what the rest of his research group is doing, because he wants to trace the process forward of replication, transcription, translation. He wants to just let this run its course, while everyone else wants to make a one-to-one correspondence between kind of genotype and phenotype. And so I felt like it was very in line with the correction she's trying to make to the normal discourse of genetic determinism.
Well, and it brings us back to this issue of sort of the relationship between the linguistic and the material, right? Because what you see in that situation, and what you see in some of these discussions of how genetics are treated, is something that we also see happening in the Haraway, and to a lesser extent in the Harding, but is this idea that mastery seems, or at least to me, seems to come through naming, right? Like it seems to be very much related to the ability to catalog, to the ability to attach or to pin a word or a phrase or an entry onto a material substance, right? And which is very Adamic in this way, right? Like Adam has the mastery over all the beasts of nature because he gets to name them. And so there's something really interesting going on here that I think they're both pushing at, which is that naming and knowing are not the same thing, and that the word, right, like the word and the thing are perhaps not even commensurate, right? Like they may be relational, but they're not even in the same category of ontology, if you will. even though they are inextricably linked. And so I think that that's a really good example to talk more about the relationship between the linguistic and the material, and biology that writes.
I would also say that the secondary thing, apart from naming, is predictability, being able to make an assessment about what's going to happen next. And so that's where the issue of agency comes into this, because of course causality is the science of knowing what's happened and why, and also what this is going to lead to next. And then agency, I think in that regard, is at odds with causality, right? Because agency is the thing that interrupts causality. It's the thing that introduces something new. And whether we want to call that something new grace, which I don't necessarily want to do, but it's tempting to do that, or whether we call it surprise, whatever it is, it's the thing that interrupts that knowing, that knowledge that always knows what's going to happen next. And of course, we saw how this plays out with Barad, and on the most precise level of quantum physics, causality breaks down, right? It becomes predictive. I mean, sorry, was statistical rather than sort of one-to-one predictive. And I think possibly, although I don't know enough to say this, I'm figuring this probably also happens on the genetic level.
Yeah.
Once they start factoring aesthetics into it, and by aesthetics I mean a kind of environmental selection that involves other subjects of the same species or other species, or preferences for colors or spaces or temperatures, right, which are not only functional but also having to do with comfort and pleasure.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot. Just, I mean, mainly kind of spurred on by this power that is. Excuse me. But what Carl was saying about grace and what are we calling this kind of surprise that interrupts or disrupts normal causal mechanisms. I've been thinking a lot in terms of wonder to describe that kind of moment of surprise. But yeah, I think there are a number of things that we can describe, and these things do, as Carl was saying, this could be the moment where some form of aesthetics is coming in, because we're using words like grace and wonder to describe this moment.
Which both of those bring us back around to Jane, right? Don't they?
Yes.
Like agency as the disruption of normal causality, right? I'm thinking in particular about her her discussion of the power grid, right? And the way in which the power grid was supposed to be completely predictable, and it was built on these assumptions, but also like calculations and engineering feats that are designed to continue the flow of electrons in a particular direction from particular places, right? And what ended up happening is that the agency of the grid got in the way of that, and just completely shut down the expected interaction, right? But I guess I would say the agency of the grid, as well as the agency of the climate, you might even say, right? Because it was also about overheating. So the combination of those two external, we'll put air quotes around that, like external agencies, is completely interrupted the expected causality of a normally functioning power grid. And the agency of material things is precisely where Jane finds wonder, right? Like, and this is
specifically in Enchantment of Modern Life.
That's what I was going to say. This is going beyond vibrant matter.
Yeah, that's her whole
her like larger life project.
Right.
But yeah, talk a little bit about have you done work with the Enchantment of Modern Life?
I've read bits and pieces of it. Was it last semester? Yeah, I think it was last semester. I mean, it's basically along these lines, thinking about just like you said, using examples such as that power grid one. Where you're looking at moments of either kind of, as Carl was saying, statistical aberrations and things, and that these are the moments to look for enchantment or one, however you're going to describe it. But yeah, she seems very intent on kind of shifting our focus to these moments that maybe are few and far between, but if it's kind of an attentional shift to what we choose to really focus on it, and she seems very intent on helping us to focus on these moments, and that these are just as prevalent and important as perhaps the more mundane aspects of them.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's a really interesting point. And it's so interesting also that like it seems to be what's tying together so many of the very different pieces that we're reading, because it also brings me back to what we were talking about last week with the pharmacokinetics, which of course I cannot help. I loved that article. But in particular, right, so Haraway talking about the way that genes write, and Alaimo talking about the agency of genetics not being so deterministic, not, she says, mechanistic, right? Like genes are not mechanistic, but they're expressive, right? And so there's this way in which we're getting at some kind of semantic potential, if you will, inside of these material agencies. And yet it also makes me wonder whether or not the semantic potential in these figurations in particular is limited to the biological, right? And so we already talked about like the problem of symbiogenesis being a little too reliant on autopoiesis, right? Mm-hmm. And so the move towards sympoiesis might be a move away from the kind of autopoietic life and the agency of biology, but there's still, at least for me, this question of like, what is the agency of the thing that we don't usually consider to be biological, right? That typically gets classed under the category of inert, or
yeah, and it seems like what's key to this is how to balance the emphasis on the agentic with risk and vulnerability that we're seeing. You know, it seems like throughout, maybe up until like throughout, it seems like our emphasis is on that vulnerability and risk. Who are these populations that have to try and find different ways of knowing in order to make sense of these risks that they're under that either aren't getting acknowledged, are invisible, this kind of thing. But then she seems to, at least especially in this chapter, be trying to balance that with a further thinking of agency there too, that it's not all about kind of what's either being inflicted on you, but it's also a balance of agency, and how do we find the right balance between those things so that we're not saying that, oh, the material and the biological is so much extremely agentic, more so than we think it is. It's this powerful thing that can disrupt everything and have all these effects. And also, how do we balance that with, how do we move from the claim that, oh no, it's passive and inert, to, oh, it's still, even though it's agentic, it still has this vulnerability to it.
Right. I think it's interesting too, because if I'm kind of going back through all of these questions about risk and vulnerability, and if I remember, most of where Alaimo is bringing in the question of risk and vulnerability tends to be the risk of the human, right? Right, because we're talking about, or at least, who is this? Is this Beck? Am I remembering that correctly? Who's the risk person? Right, because Beck is talking about risk society, right, and how we all live in this risk society, and this risk society is a sort of a toxic nature culture. Let's go with that, right? And that
good.
Part of the issue here is the vulnerability of human life towards, or the vulnerability to these foreign bodies, which is a word that I've already taken issue with, but these foreign substances colonizing the human body in a way that's not acceptable or not healthful at the very least, right? But for all of its different kinds of environmentalism, there seems to be very little discussion of the risk and vulnerability of the non-human. In a way that Haraway in particular is really drawing attention to, right? The vulnerability of the non-human, and in particular the companion species. But it brings me back, even if we go even further, like what about the risk and the vulnerability of the non-biological? So I think in particular about the mountain that we talked about in the silicosis chapter. Right, the risk of the mountain.
Inorganic matter.
Right. Well, which is another very tricky word, right? Because
life, non-life.
Well, life, non-life, organic as carbon-based, right? Like OCHEM is all about the carbon-based and the biological chemistry, but there's carbon everywhere in the living and the non-living, and that's so. Even the idea of what is organic, in many senses, is really tricky and difficult. But the mountain is constantly vulnerable, and not just to human beings, right? It's vulnerable to the agencies of weather. It's vulnerable to the agencies of tectonics, and it's vulnerable to the agencies of capitalism and industry, right? So there seems to be another piece of this puzzle that I would be really interested to hear more people talk about it in this way, and I'm just not really sure, like, if we think about these questions of genetics that are being raised in all of these different places, is like, can those ideas be applied to non-organic life forms, non-genetics based forms of matter or life in a different way?
I think this is a great question, and one, Angie, that we should flag for when we meet with Alaimo, because this question was something she was explicitly addressing in her plenary talk at the Anthropocene Feminism Alley, where she was discussing she was basically trying to think about how to reconcile her emphasis on biology in this book with the fact that the Anthropocene is making us think on geological scale and in geological terms. So she wants to and she wants to kind of temper a little bit the emphasis on the geological in the Anthropocene, and say that we need to also think about, why is it only this large geological scale that can at times kind of erase the thinking of the biological. So how can we think these two together? And this seems like a very...
Oh, you got cut off, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah, Brandon just froze.
He just froze. Oh no, he's back.
Question for her, if to address issues of climate change and but to still... Am I back?
You are back now. Yep. We're all together now. Yes.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. So can I'm going to share a few things. And
am I back?
Yeah,
okay.
You're back.
Okay, good.
Let me try
yeah. But...
Oh, sorry. Were you done? Were you finished?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're not.
So I'm going to screen share something. Here we go. Can you see that? 5 dangerous substances the food industry is pumping into your meat. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And partially, I think you can see what I'm doing there, right? Which is this notion of your meat is something that's out there that you eat, that's external rather than your own flesh, that's your own body, right? That, of course, if you're eating this meat the food industry is providing for you, it's becoming part of your flesh, and so it's being pumped into you, basically not by orally, but rather by having this animal meat become your own meat and erasing these boundaries that are only there simply on the basis of what's ingestible. And so we can unscreen shot that. There we go. Now I'm back. So I'm just going to throw that out is something to think about. The way that's being talked about and the way that coincides with some of the things that Alaimo's been talking about. The second thing, though, and this is a totally different approach, is this issue of scale and vulnerability, and issues of, say, the vulnerability of a mountain, right? Which is, I think, one of the things that we're up against possibly has to do with ecofeminism, which is, how do you talk about the gender of a mountain? Is that even a good question? And that.
Oh, Jeffrey wants to talk about that.
Yeah, okay. And so I think partially what's driving Alaimo's book too, and laudably, is her commitment to a feminist politics, and that's going to organize her discussion and her kind of archives in some particular ways, right? Did she talk about that at the conference? The issue of sort of feminism and materialism and posthumanism?
Yeah, am I back? Can you guys hear me?
You're back, yes, and
okay.
You're on time. So.
Yeah, she actually had a great. There was a lot of, and Allie, jump in if you can speak to any of this. But there was a kind of general conversation going on at the conference, responding to Dipesh Chakrabarty's characterization of the Anthropocene and history and postcolonial studies, and kind of this emphasis on the human species as this, powerful geological force that is shaping the planet in this kind of very masculine sense. And so there was a lot of pushback on that, and especially in Alaimo's talk, she was really explicit in addressing this, but there were a lot of people responding to.
All right, so.
All right, am I back? Can you guys?
Go ahead.
All right, that was pretty much it. I don't know how much of that you heard, but.
Yeah, so she was responding to Chakrabarty's sort of powerful masculinist fantasy of like the human force on geology, right? So. Let's see. So
I guess the implicitly feminist element of this is that historically, and this is maybe doesn't even bear repeating, the feminine's been on the side of the passive, which has been on the side of the material, and so to introduce questions of agency in a non-binary way is necessarily to engage in a sexual politics or a re-envisioning of sexual politics.
I think that's a really good point, Carl. Is that somehow it is inherently participating in a sexual politics to try and dismantle this passive active binary. Is that like to sum that up?
Yeah.
And that even when it's not explicitly invoking sexual politics, it is participating in that kind of sexual politics. And so then it makes me wonder. Is conceptualizing of the Anthropocene, then, is that participating in what Haraway calls humanist technophilic narcissism? Is the Anthropocene just another product of this humanist technophilic narcissism?
I guess one way to respond to that is to say there are undeniable human-caused changes to climate. But I guess to call it the Anthropocene, and I'm sure these debates I know have gone on for hours in all kinds of venues, is to undersell the fact that the results of our activity is outstripping whatever we intended, right? They're far, far, far in excess of any particular individual intentions, because they are making alliances. The results of our actions are making alliances with each other in ways that we could never foresee, right? Basically, it is, to put it in political terms, it's environmental blowback, right? We have funded a set of actors, and those actors are now acting on their own and moving independently.
Yeah,
right.
I think a really great, what comes to mind in those terms then, Carl, is the agency of genetically engineered plants, particularly crop plants, right? So you have these Monsanto GMOs that are, specifically the Roundup Ready crops are the ones that I'm thinking about, that are genetically engineered. They're called terminator seeds, right? They're genetically engineered to be able to live through the Roundup herbicide. That's what it is. It's for weeds, right? But also to be proprietary, so that they have to be repurchased every time, so they die. And what happens is, so these seeds, they produce these plants that you cannot possibly keep separate from the regular species of corn or canola or whatever it is, right? And then they get cross-pollinated, and the Roundup Ready Terminator seeds take over, right? Because they're better equipped to deal with this nature culture in which they exist, and so they're colonizing all the crops, but then they're also proprietary. So your crops, which you may have planted without these proprietary seeds, become the property of the initiating company, right? And so there's this way in which the agency of the plant to survive goes beyond what it was originally designed for, which is just to survive.
Right.
So basic industrial agriculture, right?
Well, and I think this can bring us back to the question of the cyborg too. Like, how is this kind of imagining of this human impact on a scale that we didn't anticipate and can't seem to control? Like, that kind of thinking and anxiety is very similar to the kind of thinking of, what if we create a machine that gets out of control and goes beyond what we think will happen. So in many ways, it's a similar kind of imaginary and anxiety, I think, in a lot of ways.
So what I'm picturing now is a version of Blade Runner where it's not androids and gynoids, but it's seeds. And what they do is they populate a field, and then of course they have a limited lifespan built in, and then what you're left with is a field of just gray nothing. Which I guess I'm going to use that as a really strange segue into putting a question mark about the use of science fiction as a genre and talking about this stuff. This is where we end up, right? It's a conversation about Greg Bear's work, but I'm also thinking about just because, again, I taught it on Monday, it's Cyborg Manifesto, and the way that Haraway says that her students who are able to navigate Hegel and Heidegger and what have you with total ease, when they find themselves confronted with Joanna Russ or Octavia Butler, find themselves completely befuddled, unable to deal with this stuff, right? These writers, so 70s new wave feminist sci-fi writers. But I think while it's lovely and exciting to use this kind of fiction in doing our post-humanist work, the danger or the problem with it possibly is that we are already in our current world, and maybe always already have been living in a post-human world. And so I'm more interested perhaps not in looking to the future and thinking this is something that's going to arrive, but rather recognizing how this stuff is already happening to us in the moment, which is why the Monsanto seeds are a nice example. But I'm also thinking of a book like, and I can't remember who wrote it, Diary of a Steak. Does anybody know this?
No.
This is a steak's point of view. It's a cow's pet.
Yes, I do know this. Ada gave it. Yes.
I've never read it. I've only read about it. I've been intending to teach it for ages.
What's it called again?
The Diary of a Steak.
Of a steak.
Of a steak?
Of a steak.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a cow that has a mad cow disease, and so it's going mad. And so it's a postmodern bovino viral-centric novel. And so it's not science fiction. What it is an experimental novel that's set in the present,
and this is why I love Powers' work so much.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But to also kind of maybe play devil's advocate a little bit, like, aren't there ways, maybe what we need is a shift in the way that we're thinking about science fiction, and that, certainly one of the ways to think about it is as projecting into the future, but another way to think about it is that it's those projections into the future are representations of present anxieties and fears that perhaps we can't figure out another way to deal with except to put a distance to it into the future, and that's another way for us to deal with problems and anxieties in the present. So perhaps there could be one of the ways we can think about this is a different way of incorporating science fiction into our thought where that becomes more of the emphasis. I don't know if that would make it more viable, but I do think it does need these kind of complements to maybe more experimental and even more realist considerations of scientific discourse and material phenomena.
And so one thing I can also say in response to that, and I'm going to frame this by saying there's a tendency in academia, I think, particularly for comfortable middle-class academics, to perform ethical sensitivity and always try to outdistance the ethical sensitivity of others, and thereby demonstrate, that they're in charge. And so I'm saying this, and I don't want this to come off as though I'm doing that. But one thing I think of with science fiction is, particularly if it's a kind of apocalyptic genre, what it's modeling is something that's going to happen to the white northern middle class that's already happening here in 2014 in many, many places. And so what we call science fiction is the arrival of a catastrophe in our middle class white existence that's already happening worldwide, right?
Okay, that's a great point.
In the majority world countries, for instance, right? Like
that's a really good point. Actually, I hadn't thought of that.
Well, it brings us, at least it brings me back to a really interesting thing that Haraway was saying about fact and fiction, right? In the Companion Species Manifesto. Which is a thing that I have been obsessed with for a little while, and I was just super happy to see somebody else really get into this. But right, she points out the idea that fact, right, the word fact is a past participle, right? It comes from the thing being done. It is, right, the thing being done or made or completed in the past, and thus is a real entity in the present. Because of its completion and its finality, right? Its finitude. Whereas fiction is this idea of something ongoing in the present. It's a present participle, and so there's a way in which science fiction is somehow being, maybe we might say, dishonest to its genre, right? By projecting the ongoing present into the future, it's perpetuating a sort of denial about its own making, right? And the things that it's denying a certain amount of facticity to the things that it's claiming are not yet accomplished, right?
These are all very interesting to me right now. I'm teaching a science fiction course next semester, so and I just had to put together the syllabus for it. So this is all.
Definitely share that with us. I don't know. Yeah, send me a link or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think what's really great though is that it brings us to this question of the lines that we're drawing between fact and fiction, even as literary scholars, right? So we're generally classing something like what Haraway is writing as nonfiction. And yet it reads, at least to people who are unacquainted with it, like science fiction, right? Like the notes from the daughter of a sports writer, which she opens and the Companion Species Manifesto with, and then continues with later on, like periodically throughout. I mean, that basically reads the same way as Bloodchild, right? Like Octavia Butler's short story, where you're sort of working it out. You're trying to figure out the relationship between these two species. It's like somewhat erotic. It's like there's something going on. It's generative in some way, and you have to like work all the way through it to figure out what is the relationship between the two species and how does it function and how does it work, and of course whether or not that does point back to an existing set of circumstances that we need to call into question seems to be entirely dependent upon the critical move that you make, right? And yet Haraway is very clearly classed in one genre, and Butler is very clearly classed in another genre, and so there's at least there seems to be something worth thinking about when we think about like what counts as science fiction, and why is it a fiction when it in some ways is already fact, and why is something that Donna Haraway is writing a fact that doesn't get taken as seriously as maybe it could in certain circles. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes me think too of like Latour's notion of the factish
Yes, yeah.
and how that can come into play. I feel like I brought that up multiple times, so I didn't go.
Yeah, actually, will you just remind us of what piece he talks about the factish in particular?
So I think the main one would be the his most, I think it's well, I guess it would be his second most recent book would be The Modern Cult of the Factish Gods,
right.
which I think is 2010. So I think that's the main one. And then Isabel Stenger's also, she really jumps all over this in Cosmopolitics. So she is really drawing on the notion of the factish. Possibly the thing that she draws the most from Latour is there. And I think she cites The Modern Cult of Factish Gods a lot with reference to that.
So the factish is a sort of way of talking about the fetishism.
Yeah, it's a way of realizing that, matters, the things that we think of as facts are matters of concern as well. It's kind of also that transition. It's a different way of thinking about it, and that to remind us that there are ways that scientists kind of fetishize the fact as this thing that cannot be questioned, that kind of transcends argumentation and can speak for itself, and it's kind of this sublime, transcendent object that can come in and end debates for us.
I'm reminded of so I had this argument with these online racists maybe a few months ago. I've talked about it a couple times, and I, being an academic, I responded as effectively. I wrote a blog post, and in the blog post says basically what they keep demanding apart from everything else is that I face facts and that I just understand what genetics is, and that genetics means differences in intelligence that map very neatly onto 18th century conceptions of race, and that if I'm not following that, I'm simply not facing facts. And of course, this is what my response to them was, I'm not going to face facts in that regard, because of course that's just a kind of mechanicity. It's a kind of offloading of responsibility onto things that we say, oh, we're not responsible for it, I'm simply following along in the current of facts. And so you're transforming yourself into an object and evacuating yourself of agency in favor of the big dad, who's the big judge, the father figure, the one who's in charge, the one who knows best, and you're simply following orders. And so I said, I'm not going to face facts apart from the fact that none of you is a geneticist and none of you knows what you're talking about. Link, 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 link. Your whole discourse of facts is absolute crap. And then, of course, then they wrote some responses to me and said,
Carl Slam.
Yeah, exactly. Drop the mic.
That's awesome.
And they were like, oh, this Professor Steele doesn't know anything about science. He doesn't want us to follow facts. I'm like, well, thank you for completely misunderstanding everything I just said.
Well,
So, yeah.
but you know what?
That's a great example, though. That's really perfect. That's exactly how you can defer argumentation to a fact to end it. Go ahead.
Yeah.
But what both of you guys are pointing towards, and this is what I find really interesting, is the way in which the factish, which we have this very lovely word for, helps to point towards the uncertainty of what we presume to be certain, right? So it helps to sort of undermine the fact a little bit and to highlight the fictionality of the fact. But what Carl was actually bringing up earlier when he was talking about his issue with the science fiction is not the factish, but the fictish, right? Which is the fetishization of this as an uncertainty. We're okay with this because we know it's not real, and yet there is something that contests the uncertainty of the fiction, right?
That's great. Yeah, that there is, even if it's not real, it's still, something that makes a difference and has effects. I think you just coined a very new important term. Yeah.
A fictish. The fictish.
Yes.
So there's something that, at least it seems to me, to be very important about how the term science fiction is doing some sort of reassuring work that's like, oh, this is a possible apocalyptic future that is not a space that you live in, But it's obscuring exactly what Carl is pointing out, the fact that someone else is living that reality or some portion of that reality already, right? And let's draw some attention to the non-human, right? So if we were to expand the someone else to include the non-human, we might be able to make a case that most science fiction is already happening, right? You have like mass enslavements of population for harvesting, for instance, right? So there's a lot of ways in which if we consider the reality of a situation to encompass multiple species types and the way that human beings interact with them, there's even greater reality to even the most horrific of science fiction like dystopias, right? Like, I mean, the CAFO is a perfect example of a dystopia. Carl, you're making a face. Do you?
What is the CAFO?
The CAFO, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's like a feeding operation, cattle something feeding operation. But the CAFO is the institution that collects large amounts of cattle together to feed and fatten before slaughter. So it happens sometime between their life on the range, which is a relatively normal one for cows, grazing and roaming, and then they get taken from the range and transported to the CAFO, which is where they are held in these like awful conditions until they're too fat to stand up and we kill them, right? But
concentrated animal feeding operation.
That's it. Yes, concentrated animal feeding operation, and that's it's the mechanization of mostly steak production, right? Of course, there are other animals that get treated similarly, but our American beef fetish is largely responsible for the idea of a CAFO altogether, particularly because it's. I mean, there's a lot going on, but like the way that it streamlines this process is to do like the exact opposite of what cows are designed to do, right? Like you cram them in a single space, you make them stand rather than walk, and you feed them a food that they're not evolved to eat, which is primarily corn. Why? Because Americans like their beef marbled and with greater lines of fat, so the higher fat stores in the grains translate into higher fat stores in the meats, but that's actually really, really bad for the cows. And in some cases, we even just cut holes in the side of them so that we can like move the contents of their stomachs ourselves, which is awesome. Anyway, so the CAFO is a case in point, right? A thing that's happening already, that if you were to just substitute human beings for the cows, that would already be a science fiction dystopia that somebody has already written.
Yeah.
Right.
This is I really love this conversation. This is really interesting. Just like
you're living sci-fi, Brandon.
That's great. Well, just like what are the benefits then of these kind of different genres? Like to get at something like that, do we need more of a realism or something like that to get at this problem? So it's really interesting. Like, what are the uses of the different genres, and which genres do the times demand if we want to cultivate a certain imaginary?
Well, and it also brings me back to a conversation that's been ongoing with Babel, right? The critical liberal arts, Carl, and the possibility that perhaps science fiction should be taken seriously as a critical genre instead of as fiction, right? As fictish, right? Because at present, you can read a lot of science fiction for the critique that it offers society, but you don't have to, right? You have that option of reading it as something else entirely, right? And there being absolutely no consequence for your reading it as something that has no attachment to your contemporary 21st century life. So I mean that's one thing, at least that the critical liberal arts sort of vein of thought makes me think about.
Yeah,
but
that's great.
but also reading Donna Haraway as science fiction.
Yeah.
Which I think is, because of, she's definitely drawing on science fiction tropes in her writing.
I so want you to like make your students read just the dog stories or something.
Right.
From Companion Species.
That's what I'm trying to figure out how to fit in some Haraway now.
Right, and like so that do a regular do the same trick, the Sokol trick, right?
Well, it's.
Where you're like, this is science fiction. You're like, oh no, it's not. It's literary theory.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like I think we start to see Brad starting to do this too, like with her in the On Touching, right, where she says she's been experimenting with different narrative ways of doing critical theory, right? And she says she's been trying out kind of poetic forms more, and she says this explicitly in an academic article, and I'm sure she's drawing on Haraway now, but I think that's something really interesting that those two are doing, and they're theorizing, is that they're using literary forms and modes of representation in critical thinking and theorizing. It's really fascinating.
So can I just ask? I mean, it seems like part of what, like Alaimo or whatever, like we're thinking about sci-fi as a genre, right? And I'm thinking about, part of what Alaimo is interested in, and Dirt is one of her main examples here, right? Is that, like, what sci-fi does, sure, like a lot of these things are a reality, right, for us or for, for other people that aren't middle-class white folks, right? But that it gives a kind of agency to the non-agents, right? So that sci-fi gives, and particularly, like, gives them a narrative or non-human sort of, like a non-human narrative or something. I'm thinking also of like speculative realist kind of narratives or sci-fi genres, right? That there's something like, sure, but that in a way like that isn't quite a reality, like that sci-fi opens up the genre opens up that as a possibility, right, or something like that. So I think that's also what she's interested here and what she's doing with the genes, right? So just another addition.
So then perhaps we could follow that up, Ali, with saying that maybe genes are fiction writers.
Yeah.
Right. Sure.
Right. In an interesting sense, and even more interesting, like they might be science fiction writers when you're talking specifically about genes that have been interfered with, right? That have been expressed in non-traditional ways, right? That they are writing a kind of science fiction, an ongoing becoming of a material discursive body that is eventually going to be, possibly, a living, breathing being. It's okay. Hang on, I'm still processing that. So if anybody wants to jump in and tell me that that's insane. Or
no, I'm loving all of this. I'm like jotting down notes right here. I'm just trying to take it in. This is great. Giving me a lot of stuff to think about.
Well, so I mean, it just comes back to this issue of agency and then its relationship to signification, right? So like I think the really great thing is talking about science fiction as a realm of possibility, because it's not beholden to, or it's not, to use a very broad or Haraway type term, it's not accountable to material marks on bodies, right? Like it's got this imaginative space that's allowed because it doesn't have to represent reality, that perhaps we might need to be thinking about that imaginative space as more broadly applicable, right? And so maybe imagination isn't the right word then, but the space for the swerve. If we go back to Lucretius and ignore Stephen Greenblatt altogether, right? Like the swerve.
The better swerve.
Right. Well, the swerve, as Jane brings it up when she's talking about Lucretius and the behavior of particles of matter, is the potential for matter to do something unpredictable, right?
This is the deviance, right? That
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, deviance is the word that we use in genetic expression and evolution, right? But the the swerve might be more applicable.
Well, this dual definition of deviance that Alaimo's focusing on, right? Sorry, go ahead, Angie.
No, that's fine. It's good to point out that it's a dual definition, and that's what's really important, right? And we get that, if I remember correctly, she's drawing on Lord. Is that right? The Cancer Memoirs.
Yeah, there's someone in. You're right. There's someone in particular that she's drawing on.
McWhorter?
Worked out.
I can't remember who that was.
I don't know. McWhorter, I know, is brought up a lot.
In the chapter or the last one where she was talking?
It was started in the last, but
I believe it was in Material Memoirs, right, which would have been chapter 4.
Wait, what?
But that anyway. So while we're hunting that down.
Oh no, wait. 139. It's the end of
McWhorter, right? No.
It is. Yes, McWhorter. Yep.
Okay, McWhorter. Okay, great. Yes. All right. So then, so the Lord that I'm thinking of is from the Material Memoirs chapter for sure, and it sort of ties things together, because then when we think about writing a material memoir, then that kind of writing expands, right? And okay, I promise this is going to come full circle. That there's a way in which writing science fiction or critical liberal arts might be better thought of as part of the same activity of material memoir writing. And I'm specifically thinking about like something that Haraway is doing rather than arguing for in a lot of her work, which is writing from this feminist space of accountability to one's own experience or to one's own body, right? And the material memoirs that Alaimo brings up, which is accountability to one's own body as a scientific instrument that is then being interpolated and understood through other kinds of scientific apparatuses, right? And so there's a way in which perhaps we can think about all of these different forms of writing, like material writing, science fiction writing, critical
memoirs
writing,
and autobiographical,
right, as participating in this in a material discursive genre that we might call the material memoir, and that maybe aiming for that in a particular way might be a productive way to get these things to speak to each other more coherently, but also with more urgency. If that makes some sense.
Yeah, that we need, like, it's not going to be just kind of one genre that is going to do all the thinking, kind of, that we need for these things, that we need to think together, maybe science fiction and then the memoirs, and really kind of incorporating all these different ones and seeing what benefits they can give us, and where their shortcomings are, in ways that where another genre can come in and fill in some of the shortcomings of another.
Right, but also maybe we need to be reading things like just to go back to the metaphor that we've been or not the metaphor, but the situations that we've been comparing. Maybe we need to be writing criticism that puts the CAFO alongside the, let's say, the human farms of the Matrix, right? Yeah. Because those are essentially the same thing. They're breeding animals in these large constructs in order for fuel.
Yeah.
Right? And so, like, maybe we need to be reading those as part of the same genre. And dealing with them in that way, and if you're so inclined, like a Bruce Holsinger, maybe we need to be writing creatively about those things as participating in the same phenomenon as well.
Or at least to recognize that we're writing creatively anyhow.
Right.
Cure some of those academic writerly tics, which are so hideous.
So you don't want to write a noir detective fiction about...
No, I don't like things with heroes.
Not even with Chaucer as a hero?
No, I don't like heroes. But I would write a story about the mud in the Thames.
I think that would be great. I would love to hear it, Carl. So interesting. All right. Well, then I think that this might be a good place to conclude our discussion. Yes. But I want to give everybody a chance. If you have final thoughts, right, nuggets that you want to leave the group with, I want to give you a chance to deposit those nuggets in our video, if you should have them, a la Virginia Woolf. And if you should not, then I think that's all right.
Making me hungry.
Yeah, I've got no nuggets except for the ones in the sandwich that I'm about to make.
Fair enough. Well, Virginia Woolf didn't have any nuggets either, and I think
Okay.
that's an apropos comparison, though. Well, then I guess all I will say is thanks everybody for
Thank
a
you very
really good
much.
discussion.
Thank you.
We'll be talking about what to read next shortly after we have our discussion with Stacy Alaimo. So
Okay.
thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much,
Fantastic.
Angie, and
Thank you.
for
Thank you
getting
again.
Stacy to talk with us too.
Well,
it'll be really
that didn't
great.
take very much work. She was extremely generous. So
Yeah, and I think we really set it up for like this time. I think our conversation this time really set that up to be really fruitful.
fantastic. Well, then I'll see you guys all in roughly 2 weeks, and then we'll move on to something new, maybe something with Deleuze and Guattari.
And I'll see
Cool.
you in Michigan.
All right. Yes,
Bye.
we'll see you in
Thanks, guys.
Kalamazoo.
Okay,
Bye.
Bye.